Hey guys, Christine here, a designer at ZURB. Welcome to part 3 of 5 of our Foundation CSS tutorial. In this series, you'll learn how to write CSS and how to write it effectively with Foundation. Last week, we explained specificity and how the cascade works. Today, you'll learn about CSS architecture and some best practices to help you improve your styling chops. Let's get into it. So good CSS architecture really boils down to a couple of key principles. The first principle is predictability. Your CSS should behave the way that you expect it to. So if you change something in your CSS, it shouldn't affect anything that you didn't intend to. The second principle is reusability. We always want to be building modular CSS. So this means that reusable code should be able to be applied to multiple HTML elements. The third principle is maintainability. If you add something new to your site, it shouldn't break any existing component that's already built. The last principle is scalability. So your CSS should always be easily readable by anybody on your team. There shouldn't be any guesswork needed to try to figure out what you're trying to write in your code. So now that you have a good understanding of CSS architecture, let's dive into some best practices and examples. So writing good CSS can be difficult if you're just starting out, but here are some best practices and tips to help you stay ahead of it. The first tip is to make sure that we're using classes wherever we can. Using classes helps us style our HTML elements more intentionally. So I have an example here. If I were to write a selector like this, div h1, and then change the color, that will turn all of my headers blue. But what if I just wanted to target just this first header here? Then what I want to do is give it a class, and then target that class instead. So the next tip is to always namespace your classes. Naming things is known as one of the hardest things to do in writing code. So if you struggle with this, don't worry about it. A lot of people are. The way that we understand how someone is writing their CSS heavily relies on the way that they're naming their classes. This helps us to quickly identify what the element is and what component it's relevant to. So the way namespacing works is we always name things by the component, and then at the end of it, we add a dash and then a description of the element. So as an example, let's build out a component and add some namespace classes to it. A very common component on the web is the navigation menu. So let's start building that. I'm going to write this out without any classes first, so I can show you guys how namespacing works. Let's do item 1, 2. Okay, so for this very simple menu, I'm going to name this component nav, and then all of the child elements inside of it, I'm going to name them nav item. So this makes it very clear what I'm styling if I were to use this in my CSS. If I target it nav item, it's really easy to tell that I'm targeting this item inside of the navigation menu. If I were to maybe add another element in here, like a header, I would call this nav title. So now for someone who's reading this code, they know exactly what nav title is targeting.
Hey there, K-Ball here from ZURB. I hope you're enjoying Christine's lesson, and we'll get right back to it. But first, I want to let you know about an awesome opportunity. If you want to develop like a pro, you really should be using a front-end framework. ZURB's open source Foundation framework is used by millions of developers to 10x their productivity and deliver professional websites. And we have an opportunity for you to learn from the core team who built it. Click the link right up there to learn about our next live webinar where you'll be able to ask questions to the core team, learn about the entire framework, and go from zero to website in no time flat. Check it out. And now back to Christine.
So with naming classes, you always want to stay consistent. Any child of this nav component should be namespaced with the component nav dash and then the description of the element. Sometimes this makes for class names that are a little bit longer, but that's okay because this does make your classes a lot more readable and a lot more understandable to people who aren't familiar with the code that you're writing. And you can also shorten your component names. So for example, in this navigation menu, I called the component nav instead of navigation. So there are ways where you can keep your class names short but still readable. The last tip is to always use classes when you're styling. So unless you're trying to change the positioning or layout of an element, it's best to always use a class to style an element. And by styling, we mean visual styles. So things like color, letter spacing, sizing, things like that. Make sure that you're using a class to apply those styles. So we've put a lot of emphasis on class naming so far. And as you can tell, good CSS architecture really boils down to good class naming. A well-defined system of class naming offers your team a shared understanding of CSS, and it makes it easier for everybody to read code. So if you feel like you're lost on how to start working with your team to come up with a system that will help everyone, there's actually a lot of naming systems out there already that are pretty successful at this. So we're going to go over a couple of those naming conventions today. The first one that we're going to talk about is the BEM naming convention. So that's BEM. And this naming convention is named after the elements that are key to this method of CSS writing, which are blocks, elements, and modifiers, BEM. And out of all of the naming conventions that we're going to talk about today, this is really the only system that has very strict rules about how to actually write out the class names. The other ones that we're going to talk about are very much structural and organizational standards. So blocks in the BEM system are essentially the most top-level components on the page. These are usually parent-level elements and are defined by the class named after the component. So this example is actually a perfect example. This unordered list would be considered a block inside of the BEM naming system. And the way that we write the class name is simply nav. This works within the BEM naming system. And then next, elements are children of blocks. So these are usually, so in this example, this nav title and nav item are children of this nav block. But the way that we're writing this class name is not correct for the BEM naming system. So I'm going to remove all of these class names. In the BEM naming system, elements are written with 2 underscores after the parent component. So this menu title, the class name would actually be written like this: nav 2 underscores and then title. So the 2 underscores in the system lets me know that this is an element of the nav. So if I were to see this in my CSS, nav underscore title, now I know that the style is targeting an element of the block nav. And for these next elements, same thing. I start with nav, 2 underscores, and then item. Oops. So that's an example of how we would write an element class within this naming system. And then last but not least, we have modifiers. And these are classes that will modify the block to change the visual style of the component. So a modifier class is usually written with 2 hyphens. For example, if I wanted to create a modifier class for this title, it would be nav dash dash and then large. Let's make this a large menu title. So now I'm going to write the style for this. Pixels. So now seeing these 2 hyphens, I can immediately tell that this is a modifier class and not an element class. So classes named in the BEM style are always written in this order of block, element, and modifier. This keeps it very clean and very readable. We always we always begin our class names with a block name, and this adds a little bit of extra markup to our HTML, but in the end, it makes it very readable, and it's very clear what my elements are and what the modifiers are. And if I were to see them inside of my CSS, I know exactly what I'm targeting with these classes. So the BEM style is really the only convention that states how we should write our class names. The next one that we're going to talk about is object-oriented CSS, and this is not really a naming convention. It's more of a standard for how to structure your CSS, and it's kind of a way of rethinking your CSS so that it's easier to manage and makes your code a lot more reusable. So object-oriented CSS treats all of your HTML elements as objects. It pushes the idea of modular code, which are reusable blocks of code that can be applied to and combined with other objects. So this makes writing CSS more maintainable and faster because you're not writing CSS for every single piece of HTML. The point of object-oriented CSS is that you can apply the same block of CSS onto a bunch of different modules, basically. So object-oriented CSS relies on 2 main principles. So the first one is separating structure from skin. This means that we treat the structure and positioning styles of an HTML element or an object separate from the visual styles. This is a very popular concept that's been adopted by many frameworks. For example, in Foundation, we have a very structured grid that will allow us to place our contents, all of our content with the grid, but we style each component separately with class names. So that's an example of how we're separating structure from skin. The second principle of object-oriented CSS is separating the content from its container. So this removes a component's dependency on its container. An object should behave the same regardless of whatever container it's in. So if I've built a navigation menu inside of a section header or a hero section, I should be able to, copy this entire piece of code and then move it into another container, and it should still look exactly the same. It should behave the way that I expect it to, based on the way that I've written the CSS and the way that I've structured it. So these principles encourage us to build objects as components, which a lot of frameworks are also pushing now, so that they can be moved around in the HTML and still maintain visual and structural integrity. An example of separating content from container would be our Foundation components. And Also, our new building blocks. All of these are meant to be standalone pieces of code that can be inserted into different parts of your HTML and should work the way that you expect it to. So object-oriented CSS was really the first popular CSS writing system to come into play. It really drove the concept of naming our classes after components and writing reusable and modular CSS. Similar to this next system that we're going to talk about, SMACSS, which stands for Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS. So the SMACSS Naming Convention is a system for categorizing CSS to find patterns in the rules. Categorizing CSS encourages us to be more thoughtful in the things that we're trying to style and helps us avoid mixing styles across multiple elements. If you've taken a look at the Foundation stack, we actually write our CSS in a very similar style to the SMACSS writing system. However, we are not quite as strict in the way that we write our rules. So there are 5 categories of rules under the SMACSS naming system. The first one is base rules. So these are the rules that define the default styling for an element and are applied to usually element tags, children selectors, and pseudo classes. Foundation has base styles defined for most of our typography elements, like the p tag, headers 1 through 6, links, things like that. So these would be considered base CSS rules. So if I were to write something like this, targeting the p tag, and then setting a default font size, this would be considered a base style because I'm targeting the paragraph element and then defining a default size for my paragraph text. Base styles are usually used for like targeting the body and the HTML, and then maybe setting like default padding and clearing the padding in your browser. This is probably a more common base style that you will see. I know we've really been emphasizing the use of classes whenever you want to write CSS, but in the case of the SMACSS writing system, it is absolutely okay to target things by ID as long as it is appropriate. So maybe for something like a footer on your site, you might target a footer ID, and this will be a common layout style throughout the entire site. Your footer will look like this everywhere. And then maybe you want to write a width rule to define 100% width, and then you want it to be fixed. So in this writing system, it is definitely okay to do something like this. So the next category of rules is modules. And modules are smaller components on your page. These are usually things like navigation bars. They can be buttons, menus, cards, things like that. Modules usually live inside of other layout components. So in the hierarchy of things, layouts are more high level, and then modules are a little bit more specific. So, for example, we used that earlier example of a footer. So if I had a footer here, inside I might have a menu. And in here, the menu is a module. It should be able to live inside of the footer or outside of the footer, and it should still maintain its structure based on the way that we've built it in the CSS. And then modules can also live inside of other modules. So maybe inside of my menu, I have a button. So now this is a module inside of my menu module. And this button can also exist outside of this structure without breaking. You also want to avoid using element selectors when you're styling a module, because later on you might want to expand the functionality of your module, and targeting something by an element might not work for this new module that you're trying to build later on. The next category of rules is modules. So modules are smaller components on the page. So in our previous example, we used a footer as a layout component. Modules are usually things that live inside of layout components. So for example, if I had a menu inside of my footer, the menu is a module. Some modules can also live inside of other modules. So if I had a button living inside of my menu, that button is its own standalone module. And modules should always be built to exist by themselves. It shouldn't rely on the container that it's in. Very similar to object-oriented CSS, modules should be able to live in any space of the code and not break its structure based on it, the way that it's built. So for example, in our off-canvas component, this off-canvas menu is actually toggling an isOpen class on and off based on me clicking on this button. So every time I click on this button, JavaScript will apply an isOpen class to this menu, and that will apply styles to actually push this menu over so that we can see it. So it looks like it's toggling on and off. By the way, our new docs are up and it's awesome. You can see all these videos about how to use each component individually. So hope you guys jump in here and check out our new docs. And just to give you guys an example of what a state class looks like, usually it will be written like this, is open. So it's usually prefaced by is and then dash whatever the state is. The next category is state rules. So these are the rules that define an alternate style of an element depending on its state. For example, a message might have an error state or a success state. A panel might have an open or closed state. So just by these examples, you can kind of see that states are things that are toggled usually. They're things that are based on something else, or they rely on the action being taken by the user. State rules are often selectors that are applied to the same element as a base module. So, and then these state classes are toggled on and off, usually by JavaScript. State classes should always be named according to what the state of the module is. So the next category is theme rules. Theme rules define an alternate visual style to your site and is usually housed in a separate style sheet altogether. These theme rules aren't very common in general because not all sites really require theming, but they are good for when you need to change the look of your site in order to maybe white label something to fit the style of another company, or if you wanted to, change your site to be a little more festive during a certain holiday, you might have like a theme for that holiday. Themes are not modifiers. They redefine a component's look by targeting the exact same selector. So let's take a look at an example. I have a button here in my HTML, and that is styled with this button class here. So this button is the original module that's defined in my CSS. But let's say we wanted to create like a Christmas themed button. I would target this in the exact same way with a button class and then create some new styles in here that will make this button have a Christmas theme. So let's just say the background color is green. it's looking more festive already. But so usually for a theme, for theme rules, they should always come after your original, your main CSS file, so that the cascade will, read the styles accordingly. And if you do have a theme style sheet referenced inside of your HTML, it will, take the themes or these styles that are coming after your main CSS, and these will be applied to like whatever components you're restyling. So in this example, I have my themes inside of the same like style sheet, but typically you would create a separate style sheet to house, these theming CSS rules. So like if you didn't want to have this theme on for a certain reason, you would turn it off in your project. You would, remove it from the reference or comment them out, and then it would take your module will take the style of your original CSS. So the next naming convention we're going to talk about is the ITCSS, or the inverted triangle CSS. So this is an organizational system that is used to better manage CSS. So in very big projects, you can have a ton of files, a ton of like style sheets. This can help you manage all of those things better. This system is visualized as an inverted triangle and can be used with any of the naming conventions that we mentioned earlier. So this inverted triangle, I have an example here. Right now I'm on the site x5.co. They have a really great article about what ITCSS is. And each of these layers represent different things in your CSS. So the wider the layer is, the more broad it is in terms of how CSS is affecting the page. As we move down the triangle, we're being more specific with our CSS. So up here is the most high level concepts, and then below at the very bottom are the most like specific CSS. Foundation is closer to ITCSS than most frameworks, but we're not quite all the way there yet. There are some layers of this format that are kind of convoluted inside of the Foundation framework, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So the first layer of this triangle is the settings layer. This layer works specifically with preprocessors like SASS and contains global settings options where we can easily adjust our CSS, and that will apply across multiple areas of our CSS. So common global settings are things like colors, fonts, size of fonts, things like that. So Foundation's SASS version actually contains a file like this, and it looks something like this. So in this settings file, we're using SASS variables, and this is how we can easily replace like hex codes, things like font families, to easily replace values inside of our actual CSS. The next layer is tools, and this layer is for defining global functions and something called mixins. For those of you who are familiar with SASS, that will and these will be repeated and used throughout the site. So tools are things that we use very often. So we write them once and then contain them inside of this tools folder. And we can call those like functions and CSS in different places in our project. So sometimes in our projects here at ZURB, we create a utility folder, and this is where all of our global mixins will live in. These global tools are usually referenced later on when we're actually writing the CSS. So in these top two layers here, in the settings and tools layer, there's not actually any CSS generated inside of these files. These are all blocks of code that we can call to later on in our CSS, and that's where it's actually generating CSS. The third layer is the generic layer, and this layer is the first to actually generate CSS. The CSS in here is defined the CSS in here is defining very high-level styles of a page, for example, normalizing styles and resets. So this is a file that's rarely modified because we're defining a lot of high-level, broad CSS in here. The next layer is elements. This layer is for the CSS that's used to define default element styles. So things like header tags, anchor tags, any kind of like element tags that will overwrite the defaults defined by your browser. The next layer is objects, and this is the first layer to include any class-based CSS. You can see how as we go down our inverted triangle, we're getting more and more specific. So here in the objects layer, we're targeting things more specifically with classes. This is where we style HTML a little bit more intentionally with our classes, but objects are still treated as things to be placed on the page. These styles define more structural CSS than visual CSS. Visual CSS comes in our next layer, the components. So this is where we begin to apply visual styles to elements on the page, and these are also selected with classes. This layer has the same level of specificity as objects, so these two usually work hand in hand to create one big component. This is where Foundation is kind of muddles the two layers together. In Foundation, we don't really separate these two layers very clearly. While Foundation's grid is very clearly an object layer, we don't do any styling to any of our rows and columns. Most of Foundation's components tend to combine both structural and visual CSS. And our very last layer is the trump layer. And this does exactly what it's named for. It trumps any CSS that came before it, basically. So this is our the most specific layer, or this is the layer where we write our most specific CSS. This is where all of our overriding CSS comes in. So anything written in here should be the most specific and will overwrite any of the CSS defined up in these other layers. You might find things like the important tag in the CSS here in this layer because that's what this layer is trying to do, is trying to make the CSS in here more important than anything else in your style sheets. You usually will write CSS in the trumps layer when you're trying to very specifically target a single component or an object in a particular space. So maybe you have a button inside of a hero section, and on that specific page, you need that button in that exact area to look a little bit differently. That's where you would, this is where you would write that CSS. Awesome. Now that you've learned some best practices for how to maintain good CSS architecture, it's up to you to decide how you want to write your code. Just make sure that your team is on board with it. Next week, you'll learn about Foundation's CSS and how we do things around here at ZURB. To learn more about Foundation from the people who built it, click here to check out our Intro to Foundation webinar course, where you'll learn all about how to use Foundation components and be ready to build your own responsive website in just a couple of hours. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, click here to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you don't miss any of our upcoming lessons. See you guys next week.